Grüezi Amerika. Views from the Sister Republic, a University of St. Gallen podcast by Claudia Brüwiler. Grüezi miteinander. Welcome to a new episode of Views from the Sister Republic. Today, we are discussing a very tenuous relationship. Some are even talking about a second Cold War. The issue is, you have probably already guessed it, the relations between China and the US. But today we want to zero in on the little island in the South China Sea that is actually one of the main reasons that we see such tension between these superpowers, or let's say one superpower and one superpower in the making. And I'm very lucky to have the expert on Taiwan in Switzerland with me today, and that is Simona Grano of the University of Zurich. Welcome, Simona.
Thank you so much, Claudia. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Simona, you have studied sinology at Ca' Foscari in beautiful Venice. We're all a bit jealous here that this is where you spent your studies. And you also did your PhD there. What drew you to sinology as a field of study?
It's actually embarrassing to say that I wanted to study Japanese because in Italy, we were very much drawn to the manga culture back then. It was my dad who told me, at the end of the 90s, maybe China would be better because, it's, the forthcoming market. And so I shifted to Chinese, where Venice has a long tradition because of Marco Polo. So sinology in Venice was very well developed.
Oh, okay. So you really had like the merchant relation from the beginning in your studies represented, or is that just my imagination thinking that?
No, you're right. And actually, because Veneto is also a region of, traders and businessmen. So there were a lot of practical teachings related to China and how people, could do business in it. So I think it was very hands-on approach, but it was a very good sinology study course. Yeah.
And then you came to Switzerland. You've been here at the University of Zurich for quite some time, but you've also been abroad, of course. You have been a postdoc in Taiwan as well as in Hong Kong. What drew you to these two places particularly?
Actually, when I moved to Zurich, which is 16 years ago today.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Happy anniversary.
Thank you. I was only working on China, on mainland China. And then I discovered a book in a library. Back then, I did environmental governance and I compared different places. And I discovered a book about Taiwan. And I thought it could be good to expand my comparison between, two different systems. How does environmental governance work in, authoritarian conditions and democratic? And that's how I got interested. And then I got hooked when I went to Taiwan for 1 year. And I did not shift, but I sort of expanded to cross-strait relations back then. Yeah.
Normally, I ask people about their first experience in the US, but in your case, I think I have to ask you about your first experiences in both mainland China and in Taiwan.
Yeah, so the first experience that really told me something about China, but it was really in 1999, so it was a while back, as you know, was that when we went to an outside city where there were not many foreigners back then, and the people were not really urban, we went to a zoo, and suddenly we sort of became the main attraction, the sort of white monkeys, and that was something that was cute and strange at the same time, because we realized that foreigners still back then were an attraction, which is completely changed in China just barely, almost 25 years later. As for Taiwan, I have to say I got to Taiwan many, many years later in 2011 for the first time, so very different times. And I was impressed by the big kindness and civility. I think that is also partly due to the Japanese colonial heritage, but also due to the fact that they don't have that many international relations. So they are keen to attract, foreigners and they are very nice to them. Not only to them, they're also civil among themselves. So the anecdote is that I took a taxi and I talked to this guy in Chinese and I told him I was Swiss and half Italian. And then suddenly he took me to this place. And 3 weeks later, I'm waiting for a taxi on the street. And this guy comes along and he rolls down the window and he yells in Chinese, "Hey, Swiss person, Richard." So I look at him and I'm like, oh, wow, it's you again. And so he insisted on taking me and he didn't want to be paid. And this is just an example of a variety of kind acts that actually were given to me and took place to me in Taiwan, which I really appreciated.
So a big culture of hospitality. Sounds almost American, I have to say. Have you encountered the same in China?
I mean, I have to say that people are very nice in China as well, but maybe I sort of encountered a little bit more hospitality in Taiwan. But I think that also due to the fact that in China, I was living mostly in big cities, Beijing and Shanghai, which are very big urban centers where, for obvious reasons, people are used to foreigners, but also are, more concerned with their own lives. Whereas Taiwan is a bit more laid back, I would say. So that also explains why. But you're right. It's a big culture of hospitality for sure. Yeah.
And as someone who does not speak a single word of Mandarin, are there big linguistic differences between Taiwan and mainland China Mandarin?
Well, so everyone in Taiwan speaks Mandarin. It's been implemented with the nationalist government already back then when they took over the island from the Japanese. And they really discriminated already back then against people who spoke Taiwanese.
Oh.
So the two main languages, that are composing Taiwanese are two dialects that originally come from mainland China. And back then it was forbidden to speak them in public. It was only allowed in private homes. Today, the composition of the population still is almost 85% of the people speak one of these two dialects, Hoklo. But everyone by now also speaks Mandarin. And I would even go so far as to say that even the descendants of the nationalists who only spoke Mandarin are actually now dabbling a little bit in Taiwanese because it has become also more fashionable. It used to be prohibited, and now it's much more fashionable to actually be able to say a few words, especially if you are anti-nationalist, anti-Kuomintang, you would try to speak Taiwanese to be cool.
Oh, interesting. But would you also learn it or practice it in school, or is it really a kind of subversive act?
No, I mean, it's mostly, there's a geographic division about this as well. In the north, most people speak Mandarin, where Taipei is. In the south, a lot of people in the center also speak the Hakka and Hokkien are the two dialects. But in school, it's not taught. But what I need to say is that there are now courses and universities, of course, where you can recuperate and study the history and the geography and the cultures and the languages of Taiwan, which was something that was prohibited all throughout martial law and the nationalist period. And there's now even been a recuperation of Aboriginal languages. Taiwan is a country that also has about 13 or 14 tribes of different Aboriginal groups.
That's fascinating because usually when we talk about Taiwan, we mainly look at it through two lenses. One is economic. We all know that Taiwan is a powerhouse when it comes to providing the world with the most advanced chips and semiconductors. And of course, through the security lens. And there comes the US-China relation and of course the US-Taiwanese relation into play. And even though I think I would have 100 follow-up questions on Taiwan itself, I'm afraid this is Views from the Sister Republic and in America podcast. We have to shift to the common lens, if you don't mind. You're often commenting on developments in these trans-Pacific relations, and you've closely followed both the Biden as well as the Trump and probably also all previous administrations and how they are handling the Chinese challenge as well as their commitments towards Taiwan. We have often heard it being said that there aren't that many differences between how the Biden administration handled the China issue and thus also the Taiwan issue in comparison to the Trump 1.0. But as someone who has been very close to these matters, would you agree to that? Have there been no differences between the two administrations, or is the devil in the details?
I think maybe I had to flesh it out a little bit. Of course, there have been differences, but fundamentally, just to give you the straight answer, I would say that Biden has expanded on a variety of things that were started during the Trump 1.0 administration in regards to China. And of course, by de facto, by proxy, also in regards to Taiwan. So actually, many people seem to think that, Biden was better for transatlantic relations with Europe, but also in the Indo-Pacific, including for Taiwan. And because, of course, he has rebuilt a variety of security pacts, alliances that, even though it's not openly said, are regarded as not anti-China, but in containment of China. However, I have to say that Trump is, during the first administration, actually, when the elections took place, and Biden eventually won in 2020, among the few places in this world where people really cheered for Trump was actually Taiwan and Hong Kong. And the reason for that is that people in Hong Kong and Taiwan perceived Trump as tough on China. And they were happy that finally someone actually stood his ground. So during the first Trump administration, relationship with Taiwan actually saw a boost. I think he did a lot of good things, maybe possibly out of the wrong reasons, because he just didn't know, he was not supposed to do them. What I mean with that is that, for example, he took a phone call, a congratulatory phone call, before he became president in the transitional period by Taiwan, and that had not happened since 79, when actually, the United States switched diplomatic recognition because it's a faux pas. But he took the phone call, and of course, journalists in Taiwan were thrilled, and everyone was talking what's going on. Is that the beginning of a new shift? What I have to say, I think that, many things happened during the Trump administration that were positive for Taiwan and that are not really talked about. For example, he increased weapons selling to Taiwan vis-a-vis the Obama years by quite a lot. I think by $14 billion of weapon sales to 18. He sent high-profile people to visit the island, especially Health Secretary of State Alex Azar. This was also, of course, during the Corona pandemic and so on and so forth. But I mean, he did with this especially team of people that were, to a certain extent, China hawks, like Pompeo at the beginning. He did lay the ground to use, I would say, Taiwan as an essential element to counter China. And here lies the problem, because in the end, Taiwan was sort of a card to counter China's ambition. That's how I think he perceived it. When we talk about Joe Biden, I think, it's a very different thing. He has often, and hence why people sometimes wonder, do we still have a strategic ambiguity? He has often reiterated that the United States has a commitment to come to the defense of Taiwan if it were attacked by China. And then, of course, the whole staff goes back and says, no, nothing has changed. The United States still actually abides by a one China policy, and there is still strategic ambiguity.
So meaning it can interfere on behalf of Taiwan, but it is not obliged to do so.
Exactly. I think, that there is no real change that has taken place. This is the same posture that the United States has had for a very long time, meaning that they never have openly committed nor precluded United States from intervening militarily to sort of support Taiwan's defense against China. And this is continuing to be the same. It leaves the issue open, but not only for China. Now it's mostly for China. In the past, it was also to avoid that Taiwan would do something reckless and, for example, declare independence, which would really, of course, irk China.
And if there were no strategic ambiguity, would mean that the United States would have to come to the defense for a reckless Taiwan, which of course would not be the ideal situation.
Exactly. So that was meant to keep in check both parts, mainland China and Taiwan, not to do anything reckless, as you said, not to declare independence on the side of Taiwan, and also not to attack Taiwan on the side of China. And it has worked very well until now, because both sides don't know exactly what will the United States do. But just to conclude the part about Biden, I think that, what Biden has done differently is really what we mentioned briefly before. It's the laying the groundwork for working more with allies. And I think when you're dealing with China, it's really difficult to go about it on your own. And so, of course, in the Indo-Pacific, especially, a lot of countries are happy with what has been going on with Biden. They know that if there were ever to be a conflict scenario, take Japan, they would be involved, because the United States has military bases in Okinawa and in the area. South Korea, take all of these, and it's shown in the fact that Japan is, for the first time after its, constitutional, pacifist constitution, thinking about the developing counter-strike capabilities. So I think that the Biden approach of working more with allies and not, multilaterally working with allies rather than bilaterally dealing with other countries was probably something that really put China in check.
I would like to briefly go back to what you earlier said about Trump's approach to Taiwan, namely that for him, to an extent, Taiwan was also a pawn in his game against China. What is the perception of the Taiwanese themselves? How do they view their relationship with the US, both under Trump and Biden? Do they also feel like pawns, or do they see a kinship, it might be ideological, it might be value-based. What is the Taiwanese view on this?
I think that the Taiwanese at the moment are a little bit worried. I mean, maybe we'll talk about that later, but as you know, Trump at the moment, before winning the elections, but also after winning the election, has made some comments in regards to Taiwan having to pay more for its own defenses. So it's really shown this transactional leadership style that we may presume he wants more from Taiwan, right? To get the same kind of services, for example, protection or just, selling defensive weapons. And that, of course, to go to your question, makes the Taiwanese feel a little bit uneasy. They are worried. I think the ironic thing is, I told you before that in 2020, many people were hoping for Trump to win, but now most people were hoping for Biden to win because he was considered to be the more, the safest bet, the safest alternative that would work with allies, that has made a commitment to defend Taiwan, as he has said in multiple occasions. And I think that many Taiwanese are worried of being a pawn of Trump's unpredictability, that he could decide to discard Taiwan just to get a deal with China, whatever this deal and however it will look like. And I think that they are also worried that they have been sort of obliged, starting with the Trump 1.0 administration, to shift part of the semiconductor industry in the US, for example, with the fabs in Arizona, and that's not necessarily to the advantage of Taiwan, but that they're being used to help Western countries, and especially the US, to build up its own high-tech industry, and that this is eroding the silicon shield, as is known, that has protected Taiwan so far. So I think that there's a lot of, unhappiness about also how the US has gone about Ukraine, and many people feel a kinship with the situation in Ukraine, the bigger neighbor invading the smaller country.
Yeah, and understandable.
And so they are afraid that if the US has not intervened there, although it's a very different situation, geopolitically speaking, it may also decide not to intervene, especially under Trump, to help Taiwan.
Very interesting. I'd like to come back to the aspects, what Trump 2.0 might imply in a second. But I was wondering, we have now also touched mainly on economic reasons why there is a bond between Taiwan and the US. We've already touched on a few security issues. Do you see other determinants of US-Taiwanese relations, or are we right to mainly consider these economic and security dimensions to this Trans-Pacific partnership?
I think it's a very good question that you pose, Claudia. I think it depends. I mean, if Trump now, of course, is going to be president, I also do believe that possibly economic concerns are what is going to lead the relationship between especially the United States and the rest of the world, possibly. I mean, of course, we know that he wants to impose massive tariffs on Chinese goods. So, of course, he wants to rebalance the trade deficit. So the prism of looking at this relationship through trade is absolutely correct. But there's been a shift, I think, when it comes to Taiwan. Under Biden, I think that a lot of importance was also being put on the fact that, Taiwan is a democracy. And I know this may sound as a very naive statement, the liberal talk instead of the realist talk.
Yeah, but it's a very American line of thinking.
Exactly. So often they sugarcoat their speeches in the more liberalistic tones because it sounds better to the public. I really do believe, though, that especially there's also here, of course, a sort of utilitaristic component because, of course, since after the United States left Afghanistan, they really have suffered a credibility and an image problem. And especially in East Asia, the security commitment that the United States have built, the reassurance towards allies like South Korea or Japan, is going to be completely lost if they don't intervene in the Taiwan scenario. So I do believe that in the case of Americans in general, especially in Congress, but also in the Biden administration, there used to be more than simply economic issues. There used to be also ideational issues, if we can call them like that, and also strategic concerns. I mean, Taiwan is at the heart of the first island chain. It's located in a very strategic situation because it anchors a whole series of allies of the United States from north to the Japanese archipelago down to the Philippines and the Malay archipelago. And of course, if China were ever to get Taiwan for itself. It would break this first island chain supremacy. The United States are concerned. They already have moved part of their troops from Okinawa to Guam to be a little bit more out of reach. Yeah. So I think that, these three things will continue to lead American strategic concerns in regard to Taiwan: security, economy, which you mentioned, and of course also ideological concerns.
Very briefly, just to bring in the Chinese perspective on this, I often hear from other observers of this Trans-Pacific issue that, well, China has changed dramatically under Xi Jinping, and that also this Chinese lusting after the island of Taiwan has become more increased, that he has made this expressive promise to reintegrate Taiwan. Do you also see that there is a personnel problem in terms of the Chinese leadership, or do you think that's a bit wishful thinking of people who would rather have a simplistic answer to this and just pin it on Xi Jinping?
I would put it like this. For sure, the goal of recuperating Taiwan and tying it to the lost territorium, Hong Kong, has gone back already after being colonized. Now they're just missing, of course, Taiwan. It's certainly an issue that is very important for all Chinese administrations, going after the Mao era until today. But I would, however, say that Xi Jinping seems to having been tying this issue to his persona. He has made it more personal. He has made it more urgent. However, I think that the urgency that we feel is partly dependent on Xi Jinping himself. We see this urgency and the changes also in other sectors of Chinese, more assertive position, not just towards Taiwan, but also towards Hong Kong, towards the Indian border. But I also think it has a component in how Taiwan domestically has changed, which is something that just 10 to 15 years ago you didn't have. You had, until 2016, a president in Taiwan that was very China-friendly. And so in these 8 years, of course, it was a prelude for the Chinese side, but also for the Taiwanese, to a potential unification that was finally almost taking place. Direct flights, direct civilian exchanges, direct postal exchanges, all things that had to go through Hong Kong before. There were no direct things, not even flights, until 2008. And then suddenly, in 1 year, everything changed again. A president was elected that was actually the president of the party that de facto wants for Taiwan to one day be independent, even though they don't say this any longer, not to irritate China. And in younger generations, you see higher percentages of people that don't feel a kinship with China. So I think that the reaction, to go back to your question, by the Chinese side is not only due to the fact that, Xi Jinping is a more assertive and China has become more assertive, but also to domestic changes in Taiwan, where they see the dream of unification that they thought they could achieve through economic integration suddenly fading away. And the last point, very quickly, is also maybe the so-called internationalization of the Taiwan issue, especially since the corona pandemic. If you think about it, even in Switzerland, until 5 years ago, not many people spoke about Taiwan. And
that's true, yeah.
Right. And now Taiwan is on everyone's lips. And that's not necessarily something that China wants everyone to pay attention to, that small island that they think it's actually our own province.
Yes, we learned a lot about supply chains during COVID, and thus also the importance of Taiwan, which has also been heightened by, I think, the media coverage that has also at times used quite dramatic language. You probably recall the Economist cover, the most dangerous place on earth being Taiwan. Nowadays, we might disagree given the geopolitical situation, but it remains a tension-laden region. And the question is, will there be less tension now that we see a change of government again in the US, or will this just add to the mess? So in other words, we're coming to Trump 2.0. What is your assessment of both the direction that his cabinet might be pointing us towards, and generally the campaign promises on his side when we're looking across the Pacific?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it's very difficult to answer. I would put it like this. I believe that, there are some problems with Trump himself. It's one, for me, it's his unpredictability and the comments that he made in regards to Taiwan before the elections that seem, as I said before, to indicate that he would like to have a more transactional deal where, for example, Taiwan would either shift even more of its semiconductor industry to the States or pay more for weapons or things like that. On the other hand, however, he has also a proclivity, or he seems to have a personal friendship with Xi Jinping. But we also have to say Taiwan, I believe, will continue to remain strategically important for the reasons that we have just discussed. And we also cannot forget that on top of the presidency and the people that he has picked in the cabinet, there is also Congress. And in Congress in the United States, there seems to be a bipartisan support for Taiwan that will, in my opinion, give some balance to the relationship. Coming to the cabinet, I think it's very interesting. And I was talking today I work with the Asia Society in New York, and they have, of course, firsthand information on the people that Trump is picking, also in the lower positions in regards to deal with Taiwan and China. And one of the comments was, it's going to be a rocky way ahead. I mean, he has a sort of a mixed, I would say, choice in the sense that he has picked people like Mike Waltz or Rubio. And these are known, maybe the word is a bit too strong, but they are quite known China hawks, or so they have been.
And they are banned from traveling to China as private individuals. Exactly. But I heard they'll make it work.
They'll make
for
it work.
them.
Yeah, probably they will make it work because, as you say, also China has an interest in stabilizing the relationship. But that does not change the fact that, as you said, these are quite outspoken personalities that have actually, dealt with China in a very outspoken and fierce manner by saying, that there is, human rights concerns. And of course, we should be aware, especially Waltz has said this, of a potential conflict in the Indo-Pacific with China. United States should be ready. He also has, I think, picked Elise Stefanik, right, for choice of ambassador to the United Nations. And of course, she's very sympathetic to Taiwan. But throwing in this mix something else, there's Elon Musk. Elon Musk, that has, of course, a huge interest in China. He's a huge China sympathizer. He has already spoken quite ill of Taiwan by comparing it to Hawaii, and it belongs to China. So, and he has huge, of course, economic interest with his Tesla company and fabric in Shanghai. So, it's gonna be quite interesting. But I do believe overwhelmingly the people he has chosen so far, I just heard a couple of more names today at a lower level, are actually very fierce against China, very hawkish. The last point I would make is it also depends how much he will listen to them and how long they will stay in place. Because I remember during the first administration, sometimes people got substituted, right? So
we've seen the door revolve, let's put it that way. I'm very interested in what you mentioned here in terms of this inner contradiction that we're seeing, not in his cabinet, but in, let's say, his entourage, because Musk is not part of the cabinet. In the cabinet, we have a clear direction on China. One could say that we have clearly heard from Senator Rubio in the hearings with the Senate that he sees the competition with China really in adversarial terms. It's not really about competition anymore. It's really an opposition. And managing the competition to him also means winning the competition in the end. And then comes Musk, who is not a member of cabinet, who has a very strange role that we've never seen before. What is your assessment, your feeling? I know we're all treading water here. We're on muddy grounds, reading tea leaves. But what do you think will be his influence on the foreign policy stance on China? Or does he not matter since he's not in the cabinet?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, you're of course more you are the U.S. expert, but from what I could now imagine, as you said, we're sort of like guessing. He has already made comments in regards to TikTok, for example, which is also something that during the first Trump administration was fiercely attacked by Trump. And now he's actually working in the other direction. And just yesterday I read that, because of course the whole deal with that is that if they would be able to find a US buyer, Tencent could sell it to a US buyer. And then, of course, TikTok would be able to continue to work in the way it does work now, also in the United States market. And I read yesterday that the Chinese side would like Elon Musk, the high-tech millionaire entrepreneur, to actually, purchase it. So if that's the direction we're going in, I think that it's going to be very dangerous, because this is a person that has so much money, so much power, and can influence Trump if he continues to listen to him unless they argue, and has clearly stakes and sympathies that draw him towards being very lenient for personal motivations in regards towards the Chinese, the Communist Party, and towards China, right? So I think that's detrimental to the United States' own interest, because he's actually not acting for the national interest of the United States or its citizens, but for its own. And I could foresee, but I could be wrong, of course, that could create frictions with the rest of the cabinet that is very fiercely critical of China. So I think that it's going to be very rocky in this regard, because you may have two factions that start arguing with each other, one with commensurate immense power and immense money. Starlink, I mean, is also another issue.
Oh, yeah.
And the other one that is actually supposed to be the more technical, expert, administrative side that has a completely different view of the situation.
So it's going to be the kind of excitement we don't really like to see. But as you said, it's all speculation at the moment. It's going to be interesting to see where it will end up. However, there's also another question that I think a lot of our listeners are also interested in. Looking at these conflicts between China and the US, looking at the conundrum that Taiwan is in, what role can countries like Switzerland actually play? How much room to maneuver do we have, or are we simply at the mercy of these powers?
I guess I would put it like this. Switzerland is a very cautious country in regards, of course, to doing anything that could irritate China. But alone, Switzerland has maneuvering space in the sense that it usually refrains from picking sides. This is something that even if you look at the last China strategy that is just now expired, 21-24, it's quite clearly stated where Switzerland expects other countries to respect its neutral position. Switzerland is an export-oriented country that wants to continue to trade with other countries and would like for other countries to respect this, right? So I think that, the sort of maneuvering space that Switzerland has on its own, it's actually continuing to go down this road. What I am afraid of is that in the future, if we continue to see the increase of the tensions spilling over of the China-US competition, just think of the tech sector.
Yeah.
Many countries have been posed under strain by the US, asking them de facto to pick sides. Holland with ASML not to sell this lithographic machine to China, and they are complying. So I'm afraid that we have had similar cases with ABB last year, that if this competition continues, the usual way of handling things that Switzerland has had so far, asking for other countries to respect its position, may come more and more under strain, and that they may be forced to pick a side. And I mean, the China strategy says if Switzerland is ever forced to pick a side, it will go to the side of those with whom it shares values. But so far, of course, it has been a luxury that we have had to be able not to pick sides, or not openly. I think that would change. Look at the sanctions and the Ukrainian war. I mean, Switzerland has implemented sanctions. It can. I think that would change only in the case that China would de facto invade Taiwan. In that case, I believe that probably Switzerland would actually comply with other countries and also implement sanctions. But until that point, I think we'll continue to sort of navigate this middle way.
Or muddle through. I mean, there's also reason to argue that we've not only had the luxury not to pick sides, but that maybe sometimes we had not picked side, even though it might have been prudent to pick sides earlier. What I'm saying, some are arguing that by exposing oneself to China, trading also in sensitive areas, you become part of the Chinese game. Do you see any validity in this argument, or is that too hawkish?
No, I would tend to agree with it. But of course, I'm also sometimes a little bit critical of how the Swiss government deals with China. I think it's rather naive sometimes. And so I would also think if you have too much of a trade exposure, and this we see in many other countries as well at the moment. That's why, for example, Ursula von der Leyen has invented the term of de-risking rather than decoupling, is the fact that we want to be able to continue to do business with China, but not being too overly exposed. And that's something that we see is actually prudent, because even after Russia invaded Ukraine, we realized that Europe and Germany in particular were overly dependent on one single market for certain products like gas. And that's a problem when something like this happens. So I think that you're right to point out, or these people who pointed out are correct saying that if you are overly dependent on one single market that is also politically problematic and possibly may one day invade another country that would precipitate sanctions, even just from a very utilitarian perspective, that could really have a backlash on Switzerland as well.
Let's not hope for it. But thank you so much, Simona, for giving us such a panorama of US-Taiwanese relations and all the difficulties that we might see in the future. We are always hoping for the best, but we need to be prepared for the worst. Now, for all those who want to learn more about Taiwan and the relationships with the United States, what would you recommend them to listen to, watch, or read next?
So I'm reading a brilliant novel that really talks about a US-Taiwanese and really expounds very well the beginning of the relationship between the United States and the Republic of China, Taiwan's official name, and goes throughout the decades until basically the end of martial law. And it's really good to understand, the intricacies of how opportunistic also United States support was of so-called Free China, which was nothing but an authoritarian regime, and how it transformed into, the blossoming democracy that Taiwan is. So this book is called actually Green Island. It's the name of a small island where the nationalists implemented a prison. You can go and see it as a museum. So the name of it is Green Island. And the author is Shauna Young Ryan. It's a very, very interesting book for US, Taiwanese, and Chinese relationship.
This sounds indeed like a very promising read. Maybe something people might take on their skiing trips. Who knows? Thank you so much, Simona, also for the tip at the end. And to everyone else, thank you for listening. And I look forward to having you with us again. Auf Wiedersehen.
Grüezi Amerika. Views from the Sister Republic, a University of St. Gallen podcast by Claudia Brühwiler.